Okay, I think we are recording. Um, Hello, everybody. We are going to go over chapter 11. Today, chapter 11 is technically not on the list of required chapters for this course, but we have the option of doing one of a couple of given chapters as sort of our extra chapter. And this is one I feel like okay, bye, dovetails well with what we've talked about so far. It's about social psychology, as you can see here from slide one. Incidentally, there will probably be some furry friends that join us at some point, or just walk off and go do their own thing. But this is our new house. Welcome. We're here in the living room. But yeah, social psychology, getting into the behavior, because always when we're talking about psychology, we're talking about behaviors of how we perform in social groups. We will talk about a bunch of different experiments that have measured this. It's like, just like in other chapters, we've talked about famous experiments that have kind of illustrated these concepts or kind of pushed us in a different direction in terms of how we think about this stuff. There are several of those in the social psychology realm as well. Okay. So the book, the book loves a framing device. So we're going to kind of frame this through this idea of online dating. And so there's this couple here, Dennis and Alexa, who I believe they met on Tinder. So they met using Tinder. After initial date, things fizzled, and sort of a big chunk of the chapter and how they sort of look at everything is trying to determine like how and why we behave in certain situations, like this one with somebody strange, where the goal is to try and form a relationship. So like it says here, social psychology is interested in understanding people's actions, thoughts, and feelings in response to others. So definition, social psychology is the study of human cognition, emotion, and behavior in relation to others. So a bunch of stuff that we've already talked about, cognition, emotion, behavior. But this time we're incorporating specifically how these things relate to people around us. It is different from something like sociology, which is, like it says here, pretty much just focusing on the groups themselves, not necessarily the interactions between the individuals that make up the group, which is what we're going to be talking about with social psychology. So let's think about like, a big social setting in society. So let's think about like churches. And so a sociologist would focus on like the congregation of the church itself, whereas a social psychologist would actually focus on the individual interactions and the behaviors of the people within that congregation. And there are different methodologies, like this here, adopted by each field because they have different goals and different aims. There's a lot of crossover, but they're not the same thing. Okay, so talking about research methods in social psychology. So earlier on, we talked about deception in research and how that's generally frowned upon, but social psychology is probably the biggest exception to that. Because if you're trying to get people to behave truly to who they are and how they would behave in a given situation, you kind of have to trick them into thinking that nothing is actually happening. Where you see this picture here, this is a film depiction of a very famous experiment, Milgram's social psychology experiment, which we'll talk about a lot. But yeah, they use deception because they are trying to get people to act like their true selves, which can be difficult in a research setting. They also use confederates, which in this case, we're talking about people that are working for the researchers, but the people that are being researched on don't realize that they're part of the experiment. They just think that they're another test subject. Yeah, sure, participants aren't necessarily harmful to participants. We have this Institutional Review Board, the IRB, largely because of things like Milgram's experiment, requires researchers to debrief the participants. So once they're done, they tell the participants what just happened. Okay. So social cognition, I'm talking about the way people think about others, attend to social information, and use this information in their lives, both consciously and unconsciously. We've talked a lot about cognition so far in the semester. Cognition, sort of a shorthand for it, is the things that are going on in your brain. Basically, that's a very simple definition for it. But thinking about how those things play themselves out socially, area of interest for social psychologists are attributions or interpreting the behavior of others. Why are people doing the things that they are doing? What can that be chalked up to? And it's actually more complicated than you might think. Because attributions further press into that idea. Beliefs one develops to explain human behaviors and characteristics as well as situations. Okay, so your brain is constantly trying to make sense of things. It's constantly trying to contextualize what it's seeing and hearing, and just forming categories and groups, heuristics, things to make sense of the world around it. And so we would call that an attribution, discussing an attribute of something. So there's three dimensions: controllable, uncontrollable, and these are all existing on spectrums. Stable and unstable, internal, external. And so controllable, uncontrollable, like thinking about like how a given circumstance, how much control a person has over it. We'll talk about the different attribution errors that we can come up with. And then stable and unstable, and then internal, external, sort of similar to controllable and uncontrollable. How much is due to people that, or how much is due to that person's actual specific behavior? How much is due to external factors? Okay, so talking about selfies and specifically how social media affects psychology, because we're talking about social psychology in 2021. Social media obviously plays into that a good bit because a lot of people are on it and a lot of people exhibit certain behaviors for certain reasons. So the question they ask is, what is your goal when taking selfies? Ideas that you're trying to present the best version of yourself possible, and then figuring out how others might perceive that. So based on the camera, the placement of the camera, the lighting, that kind of stuff, you can present different versions of yourself is the idea here. And how, based on how that happens, it says here, less open, less socially attractive, less trustworthy, more narcissistic might be the way, depending on how you frame that selfie, or even the fact that you took it at all might shape that. Okay, so there's 4 common attribution errors, because a lot of times when we try and attribute certain, characteristics to people's behaviors, we do it incorrectly because we're humans and we're kind of dumb sometimes. Okay, so the one that's the most prominent, probably the most famous, is the fundamental attribution error. And there's a really good graphic here, down here, that shows you kind of like examples of how this might play itself out. So we'll talk more about the fundamental attribution error here in a second. But here on this graphic, you can see, and all this is being presented through this waiter, or, this is actually an actor, but actor trying to so yeah, I backed that up a little bit. So the actor in this case, we're not talking about like a Hollywood actor, we're talking about somebody who's participating in the activity, like doing the thing that the observer is observing. And so in this case, the actor is a waiter who has spilled something, and then the observer is interpreting why that took place. Okay, so fundamental attribution error. This observer tends to think actor's behavior is caused by internal characteristics, ignoring the role of the situation. So going back to our internal-external continuum spectrum here. So fundamental attribution error believes that, in this case, the person's behavior is pretty heavily influenced by who they are. So fundamentally, that impacts their behavior. Okay, so this person saying that waiter is so clumsy, and in this case they are ignoring the external circumstances such as a slippery floor, because this guy works in food service and sometimes the floor is wet, and he might have tripped over something, he might have got his attention called somewhere else by another customer, and he wasn't looking where he was going, something like that. It may or may not be completely contingent on who he is as a person. It probably isn't. Okay, so the just world hypothesis, the idea that, one tends to think people get what they deserve. Okay, so in this case, our waiter guy gets fired, and then our observer says he must be a really lousy waiter to get fired, may ignore other things that may have gone into that decision. Like it says here, that the manager would rather hire a friend instead, or the manager's just a jerk, all that kind of stuff goes into the just world hypothesis. It's not always that simple as, everything's a meritocracy. Okay, so the self-serving bias. We tend to attribute our successes and internal characteristics and failures to external circumstances. So in here, say, guy gets a lot of tips. He says, I must be an excellent waiter because I got a lot of tips. And then conversely, if you get not that many tips, you say that the diners were the problem. Okay. So, and then we have the false consensus effect, which is the idea where we sort of project our own beliefs and biases onto other people. Yeah, assume the actor is behaving similarly to how that person would act in that situation. So in this case, The observer sees the actor, spill looks like some kind of drink. I says, oh no, he's going to get angry and blame someone else. That's what I do when I feel embarrassed. So sort of projecting, talked about projecting in our last chapter, projecting how you would feel in a given situation onto somebody else. And that sounds like an ego defense mechanism. And all of this sounds like an ego defense mechanism. They are very closely tied ideas, very similar. Yeah, okay. We've gone to a little bit more on the fundamental attribution error. The tendency to overestimate the degree to which the characteristics of an individual are the cause of an event, to underestimate the involvement of situational factors. Because we talked about, and when we talk about personality theory and trait theory, how these things are sort of like part of who we are and don't really change that much over time. And so this is the idea that those things cause behaviors and cause events. So dispositional attributions, situational attributions, in this case, dispositional, we are attributing based on a person's disposition. Okay, so the way that they, their mood, their emotions, things like that. This has happened because of those things. And situational attributions, how they act in a given situation. Good question here is thinking of a time when you have done something like that. Oh, well, this person, because of the way they are, obviously, this thing happened to them. Why is this such a common error? Talked about how our brain is always making these heuristics. We talked about that way back in another chapter. We have a tendency to make quick decisions about others based on the labels we assign to them because it's easier. Your brain works really well in shortcuts. And again, we are venturing into stereotyping territory because that's kind of how our brains work a lot of times. And our fundamental attribution error definitely ties into those things because there can be a tendency to say, oh, well, because this person exhibits this characteristic like race or age or gender, obviously like their behavior in this given circumstance is related to those things. We may not consciously be doing that, but we are fundamentally attributing it to that trait characteristic. Okay, just world hypothesis. Tendency to believe that the world is a fair place and individuals generally get what they deserve. Okay, so like it says here, it helps us make sense of the world. So the idea of meritocracy, like, if we see somebody get fired, oh, it's because they're bad at their job. Oh, if a team, I see this a lot of times in sports, like, if a team doesn't make it to a certain round of the playoffs that people expected them to, or, don't play as well on a given day, it's because they're bad or they're mentally weak or whatever. This idea that, like I said, that everything's kind of a meritocracy. It's based on your value as a person or as an entity, what happens to you. It's just world hypothesis. Self-serving bias, the tendency to attribute our successes to personal characteristics and our failures to environmental factors. And so it's the idea that if we do well, it's because of who we are. And if we fail, it's because it's somebody else's fault. And this is definitely a pretty universal characteristic because, again, we are sort of all the protagonists in our own story, and this shapes a lot of the way that we behave and contextualize what we see around us. And the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate the degree to which others think or act like we do. So assuming that other people around us have the same beliefs that we do or the same understanding of how a particular group might behave. In this case, like it says here, we have an overabundance of information about ourselves and often limited information about others because we are the protagonists in all of our own story and have a tendency to believe that because we think it, or we believe it, or we have evidence to one particular conclusion that other people are obviously going to think the same. These are errors. We call them attribution errors because they are wrong. Okay, attitudes, pretty much exactly what they sound like, relatively stable thoughts, feelings, and responses one has toward people, situations, ideas, and things. Okay, so where do attitudes come from? How do we get to the point where we have a certain level of interest or a positive or negative feeling about something? Okay, so an interplay between nature and nurture. So there's a question of like, I've told you guys that I'm a big Atlanta Braves fan. Do I have that desire because it's genetic, or do I have it because it was nurtured into me? So if you're like good at music, or you like a certain type of book, like, is this something that is because of your environment, or is it because your mom may have liked something like that? So Going all the way back to classical conditioning and observational learning, both of these things definitely color our attitudes, which kind of makes sense because if we are classical conditioning, talk about association, if we're continually associating something with like bad feelings or bad outcomes, then our attitude about that thing is probably going to be worse. And then vice versa, if or not vice versa, but inversely, if our attitudes are good and we've had that association made with good stuff over a period of time, our attitudes about it is going to be positive. This is largely how advertising works, especially with spokespeople. If we can associate this product with something that these people like, they will have generally more positive attitudes about that product going forward. Observational learning also plays into this, because if we see somebody that we like or respect or even love exhibiting a certain set of behaviors or attitudes, then we are more likely to adopt those attitudes as well. But going back to our twin studies, because psychologists love twin studies, show identical twins have more similar attitudes than fraternal twins on topics such as politics, divorce, voluntary exercise, and reading books. So there is some evidence that would show that there might be some hereditary component to the way that we think about things. All right. All right. Attitudes are comprised of cognitive, affective, and behavioral components. Okay, so we're talking about affective, talking about mood. So cognitive, how we think, affective component, emotional evaluation, and behavioral components. Can attitudes predict behavior? So in this case, we're talking about attitude towards personal debt. So the cognitive component in this case, example they use here is, I think it's unwise to carry a large amount of personal debt without a clear plan for repayment. So that's your belief. That is your attitude towards that. The emotional attitude would be, I feel proud when I pay in full for purchases. So there's our idea. There's sort of our emotional relationship to it. And then our behavioral component, which is obviously going to be paying, doing things to avoid, carrying a large amount of personal debt, because we have that attitude. And so we will behave accordingly. I maintain a minimum balance in my bank account for emergencies. I review my college loan situation regularly. Okay, so all these things play off of each other and sort of form this positive feedback loop towards attitudes. So the question, can attitudes predict behavior? Yes, they can. Now, sometimes what we say we think, so our cognitive component and our behavioral component don't match up. Okay, so cognitive dissonance is what we would describe that phenomenon as. So it's a state of tension that results when behaviors are inconsistent with attitudes, because that can't happen. So it's resolved by changing the attitude or behavior. So one of those things has to give. So the example they use here is this experiment from 1959. Participants were paid a sum of money to tell subsequent participants they completed an interesting task. In reality, the task they completed was very boring. Okay, so there we have an attitude towards a task, which both groups think that this task was boring. The cognitive dissonance stems from the conflict between the attitude that the task was boring and the behavior, telling others it was interesting. Okay, so that is a dissonant level of attitude there. So key finding is that participants who were paid higher sums of money to complete a tedious task were less inclined to change their attitude to match their claim that they enjoyed the task. And so the people that got paid more money were more likely to say things like, instead of like the boring task, because I got paid $20, not because I actually liked it. So the dissonance there is, the idea they were telling other people that they enjoyed the task when they actually didn't. So the behavioral element would be communicating what happened, and then the more cognitive and affective one would be that they so I had to say the task was boring, or what they thought. So they thought the task was boring and they had to tell somebody else it was interesting. All right, so now we're sort of wandering into the social element of all of this stuff. So social influence, how a person is affected by others as evidence in behaviors, emotions, and cognition, because our sort of social network can influence the way that we think about a lot of these things. Powerful, yet often unspoken form of social influence is expectations. So other people's behavior is partly derived from how we view them, just as our behavior is partly derived from how others view us. So this idea that if you expect to, do a certain thing, or if other people expect you to do a certain thing, you're more likely to accomplish that. It's the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and they use this example of this college preparatory school. They raise expectations for its students, putting every single one of them on a college track. So we have this expectation: if somebody gets accepted to this school, they are going to college. Like, that is the stated goal. It's high expectations combined with hard work of students, families, faculty, and staff. Impressive results. Every Eastside graduate has attended a four-year college. So the idea there is that the expectation that all these people are going to accomplish this certain thing sort of created this, like we said earlier, positive feedback loop of, because we set this expectation, because we said this was going to happen, so this thing actually did happen. Now that can go the other way too. So if someone is, expected to perform less well, so based on, going back to our discussion about attitudes. So let's say a teacher has less positive attitudes about certain gender, kids from a certain race or socioeconomic background. So if they set low expectations going into that relationship, then it's a lot more likely for that child to not perform as well as the people that they do have high expectations for. So when we get into like things, potentially being systemic, that's where that discussion starts, really. It's this idea of expectations and how likely someone is to actually fulfill them based on those expectations being set. Okay, persuasion. Okay, so intentionally trying to make people change their attitudes and beliefs, which may lead to changes in their behaviors, because we all have very different attitudes and beliefs, and there are certain techniques that can help people change those. Okay, so there's three factors of persuasive power from this guy, Carl Hovland. So the source. So who is trying to persuade you to do something? Okay, so the source ideally would have good credibility, good expertise, high levels of trustworthiness, and attractiveness, because we are more prone to accepting messages that we may or may not agree with or have heard before from attractive people. Credibility, so the person has to have some sort of credential to be able to put that message forward. Expertise, this thing go hand in hand, so there has to be some sort of level of familiarity with the material. Trustworthiness, and this one, it can get a little tricky because we've talked about like expectations and bias and who gets to be trustworthy and who doesn't, but the trustworthiness, the perceived trustworthiness of the messenger definitely goes a long way. So this is basically saying that the messenger matters and that the source has a pretty significant influence over whether or not someone can persuade you to do something. Okay, then there's the message itself. Okay, so let's say you have your great source, the person that you want to communicate this message. So the message also has to be pretty finely tuned. It has to be logical and to the point. And then also you can use fear or some sort of expedited, timeline. So you have to get somebody nudged in a particular direction. And ideally, if the logical part of the point doesn't get you where you want them to go, you would use something like a fear appeal. And then the audience also matters. And so the messenger matters, the message itself matters, and who you are delivering the message to is also important. So age, emotional state, and mental focus. Age matters. So if you're talking about people who are less likely to be influenced, I think the book uses the idea that people from like 20 to 60 are a lot less likely to be persuaded by any given idea, really, which makes sense because at that point you sort of developed your own thoughts, you're pretty mature mentally. And then for the next 40 years, you're just kind of hard to persuade. Emotional state. So you're more likely to be open to new information when you're happy and less likely when you're mad. And then mental focus. How much mental and emotional energy can you devote to trying to understand this idea? Because if you are not capable of paying attention, you are going to be a lot less likely to adopt that new idea or belief. Okay, so you're talking about the elaboration likelihood model. Persuasion hinges on how people think about an argument. There's two pathways. You can attack these things in one of two ways. You can go the direct one, to focus on the content of the message, employ critical thinking. So really like hone in on the logicalness of what you're saying, and try and persuade people that way. Or you can go to the peripheral route, paying attention to issue irrelevant cues. So instead of focusing on a specific message, you are honing in on some other part that may not actually be relevant to the issue itself. And if all of this sounds like stuff that comes up in politics a lot, you're right, because functionally what you're trying to do, if you're running a campaign, which a lot of people are about to start doing because the midterms are a year from now, and there's going to be a lot of people running for spots in Congress. You are trying to get people to think a particular way so that they will vote for a particular person. So you can either really go in on the issue heavy message, or you can go to things that may not be particularly issue heavy. And you will see ads and speeches in both of these models. So connecting our materials to stuff that's happening in real life. And then we have this idea of compliance. So changes in behavior at the request or direction of another person or group who in general does not have any true authority. Okay, so there's two ways that you can get to this point. The foot in the door technique involves making a small request first, followed by a larger request. Okay, so you have asking for a small piece, and then if that gets accepted, because we're more likely to accept something smaller before somebody asks for something else much bigger. So think about like donation. Somebody asks for, okay, well, it's just $5 at first, and then once you sort of get your foot in the door, like it says here, once you have established that relationship, later on, you're more likely to be able to follow that up with a larger request. And then you also have the door in the face technique, which is the idea that if you make that large request first, so if you ask for a bigger donation up front, people turn that away. The smaller request looks significantly smaller in contrast, and you are more likely to get compliance with that smaller request. So and the idea there also is that the person asking doesn't have any true authority. They don't really have any power over you, but they're still getting you to comply. This is directly associated with persuasion. Okay. Conformity, also part of our decision-making process. Tendency to modify behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and opinions to match those of others. We conform to norms or standards of the social environment. We conform to fit in or belong. So we talked about social norms a good bit with our psychological disorder unit. And so an example they use here is Malala Yousafzai, a very important activist, good example of a nonconformist. So in this case, we are pretty heavily incentivized to conform to a lot of different societal norms, and not all of these are bad. Like a lot of these are very good. Like we don't all go around murdering people because we have established that that is not good. We are all sort of conforming to that idea. But where this can get interesting is people are a lot more likely to go along with behavior if other people around them are exhibiting it. They're more likely to conform to that, whether they want to or not. All right, so idea here is that next time you're in a crowded area, look up and keep your eyes toward the sky and see how many people follow you, because that's sort of, behavior that even deviant behavior outside of what we would typically do. Do some people change their gazes to match yours, even though there's no indication that something's happening above, or don't they? So like a fun little social experiment there. But scientifically, research-wise, there's also been a connection established here to conformity. So we're talking about Ash's conformity experiment. So you can see these lines here on the left side of the screen. So the idea here was that in the first round of this experiment, they were trying to see, because like clearly there's one line that's closer to the first one than the other ones. But what they wanted to do was see if people would continue to go with their gut, or if other people around them were deliberately, and these people were Confederates, they were working with the researchers, if people deliberately gave wrong answers, were the people that were actually part of the experiment more likely or less likely, or no change at all, to actually go with what they believed was correct, or would they conform to what other people around them were saying? So because if let's say we're talking in class and I'm like asking a question like we do in lecture all the time, and say, well, what's this thing, what's a characteristic symptom of schizophrenia? And we know that's like hallucination is one of them, and I'm asking, like, let's just say, for the sake of argument, the hallucination is the one I'm looking for, and somebody might know that hallucination is one of them, but if somebody or even multiple people around them say, oh no, it's manic episodes, they may know that that's wrong, but the fact that other people around them are saying something else might make them question their own judgment, and even like put that answer down on a test potentially. So that's the idea behind that. Like it says here, Asked to look at the lines on two cards, announcing which of the comparison lines was closest and linked to the standard line. So yeah, asked which one they believe was closest, but in roughly 37% of the trials, participants went along with the group and provided the incorrect answer because the group dynamic is very powerful in our decision making. So why conform? Okay, so normative social influence, idea that yeah, like we all are sort of, it's like social gravity, like we're all pulled towards this norms that people can understand and help make sense of the world around us. Informational social influence, reference group, so the idea that you can look at, see what other people have done. Also influenced by situational factors. All right, last thing. So we're talking about summing up the concepts of social influence. So persuasion, we talked about the different techniques for that. Intentionally trying to make people change their attitudes and belief, which may or may not lead to changes in behavior. Example is trusting our product because it contains the purest ingredients. Is that true? Who knows? But you are appealing to a particular part of that consumer psychology to try and get them to do what you want them to do. And like I said, we talked about the various strategies that political campaigns use to elicit a certain amount of behavior. All right, so compliance, voluntarily changing the behavior at the request or direction of the person or group who in general does not have any authority over you. In this case, it says remove your shoes before you walk into the house because you have an X to do so. So people who own the house can't do anything to you if you don't do it, but because you are trying to comply with what they want, you will exhibit that behavior, even if it's something that's strange or alien to you. Conformity is the tendency to modify behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and opinions to match those of others. Idea here is removing your shoes before you walk into the house because everyone else does. And so if you see everybody else taking off their shoes before they come in, that's what we do at our house, then you would do the same. And then obedience, changing your behavior because you have been ordered to do so by an authority figure. So following a detour sign instead of just, going rogue and doing whatever you want, instead of going around the roundabout, just going straight through it. That's not a thing that you should do. But obedience is because you have been ordered to do so by an authority figure. You can get in trouble if you don't do this. Yeah, so that is our first part of social psychology. We'll go back over this at the beginning of next week, and then we will also sprinkle in a little bit of statistic appendix A. We actually talked a lot about the different statistical concepts that are in that a good bit way early on in the semester, like chapter 1. We will go over the stuff that we didn't. Like I said, I included chapter 11, not because it's going to be on this test, but there might be a couple of chapter 11 questions on the exam. Not too many because we're not going over it for super long, but it is a good sort of dovetails well, like I said, with a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. And then we will go over your final papers on Monday and Tuesday. We will get you guys ready for those. I had a question about when that's going to be due. That's probably going to be due at the same time as the final exam to give you guys a good amount of time to get those papers done. And yeah, we will go back over all of this early next week. I will see you guys then. Bye.